Hi, so good afternoon. This is Dr. Boss, and I wanted to drop you a quick message to let you know that I looked at everybody's draft final manuscript and left a whole bunch of feedback so that you should be able to make another revision. I also want to just follow up because many of you were writing an integrative review, but it looks like, or I got the feeling that there were some confusion between what is an integrative review or a systematic review and a meta-analysis. So I thought I would go over that real quick. So what I have here, this is my loneliness systematic review. So a systematic review means that I did a comprehensive search of the literature, and I'm confident that I got every single article that met my inclusion criteria. So, my inclusion criteria somewhere over here about original research written in English, study on human participants greater than 60 years, and published between 2000 and 2013. So that means that I could stand up in a room in front of people and say I'm 99% sure that I got every single article that meets this criteria. An integrative review is similar in the fact that you do have inclusion criteria and exclusion, and you do a formal search, but you don't have to be sure, or you don't even have to say that you got every single article. You can say, yes, I did a thorough, comprehensive search, and these are the articles that I came up with. So, maybe if there were 20 articles, you only found 10, but that's okay. It doesn't matter because you're not saying that you found all of them. And then a meta-analysis is actual research. So what they do is they actually do a systematic review, and then they take all the data from the studies and actually do statistics to determine whatever they want to determine. So that means, and I've never done it, but it means like they could add up all the sample size. And so then you'd add up 13,000, 1,000, 497, add them all up, and you get 20,000 participants. And so they combine all of these into one, and they're able to do actual statistics and then come up with findings. So that's considered a research study. And of course, that's not what we're doing. So what y'all have done in your EBP course is a integrative review. So that's what you'll call it. So I also wanted to talk about the difference between the findings section and the discussion section. So typically, those are going to be two distinct, different studies or sections. So in the results section, I start here, and I started with the design. You simply just report the results. You don't put your opinion, you don't put your thought, you don't put anything, just the facts. So for me, in this loneliness study, it was relevant, and what you report here will be different depending on what's relevant to your topic. So for me, it was relevant, the design of the study. So here I have 10 studies, 5 are cross-sectional, and I cite them all. 5 are longitudinal, and I cite them all. And then with the follow-up period in the longitudinal was from 1 year to 68 years, so that's relevant. 8 studies had findings from participants enrolled in large population-based studies. And then I talked about Amsterdam study, the Helsinki, the Lothian birth cohort. So that's just a simple description, the sample. This was also relevant, I thought, because we're talking about loneliness. So 8 out of 10 studies were conducted in Europe. And so then I listed all the different countries. For a total of 26,000 participants across all studies. All authors provided sampling methods, sample size, although the sampling methods and specific details varied. So I just went on just to talk about, because I thought with loneliness, it's important for you to know, were they male, were they female, how old were they, what country are they in, because different topics are taboo to talk about in different countries. And, I'll bring up the point later in this discussion, is why was all of these done in, 8 of them were done in Europe. So we only had 2 done here. We really need to beef up what we're doing here in America, so that we can see if there's a difference and see what we need to do. I just put this in here. None of my studies had a theoretical basis. However, they all proposed that certain psychosocial factors, including loneliness, were thought to influence cognitive function. And so that was implied as the theoretical basis for research. I put covariates in here because these are things that are related to, that could affect cognition, age, gender, educational status. The measurement of loneliness was kind of a big deal for mine and very relevant because the measurement varied among studies. So most researchers used 1 or 2 Likert style or yes/no format questions to measure loneliness. So here's my table. But that meant, and I thought it was weird, that some of them just said, do you feel lonely at the present time? And the answer was yes or no. And then they would also ask, how often do you experience loneliness? And then you could say whatever. However, then the other 5 studies, they actually used this UCLA loneliness scale, or the De Jong-Gierveld loneliness scale. So you had 5 of the study authors asked yes/no questions, and 5 of them used this UCLA scale or the other scale. So it was really kind of cool that they were easily divided into 2 parts of measurement. The way they measured cognitive function, this was all over the place. So again, I don't even need to finish this, but when I'm talking about measurements of cognitive function, it was important and relevant to say that various domains were measured. So global cognitive function, executive, verbal reasoning, processing, immediate and delayed recall, episodic, blah, blah, blah. So that was kind of relevant because none of the studies, we didn't all measure executive function. All the studies measured all these different things. So the point of the results section is to paint a picture of what's relevant for the reader to really understand and get a good idea of your articles. So then you can just read this, but it's just the facts. There's no thought, there's no personal thought, there's no anything. The only thing that's in there are the findings. And so this goes on and on. It's pretty long. And I had it divided into sections that made sense. And then finally get over here to the discussion. And I always like to restate the purpose of the systematic review or the integrative review, because you've read all this and sometimes you forget, what was the purpose again? So the purpose was to examine associations of loneliness and cognitive function in the aging population. Overall findings from the 10 studies largely indicate that loneliness is negatively associated with cognitive function. So that means if you have high loneliness, you have low cognitive function. Main findings were significant and negative correlations of loneliness with global cognitive function, IQ, processing. So I'm basically just synthesizing. This first paragraph is synthesizing. These are the main findings. So I had a cool result here where overall findings from all 10 studies said the same thing. And that just went on. Sometimes a lot of times I'll talk about my findings compared to other findings in the literature that maybe for whatever reason I didn't include that study. This was important to talk about. The findings of 10 studies were consistent despite the use of a different methodology to assess loneliness. So that was something I was going to talk about. So that's something that I put in the findings so that you can see all of these different ways of measuring loneliness. So I talk here about the Likert 10 scale, or the yes-no questions, and here about the UCLA scale. I go back and talk about some of the confounding variables that I also mentioned in the findings section. The current literature right here does not clarify the cause and effect relationship between loneliness, so it may lead to cognitive decline for these reasons that we think, but we're not really sure. So Schnitger found that decreased verbal fluency was a significant predictor for loneliness, supporting the latter case. Poor communication skills, blah, blah, blah. So then I'm talking about specific articles and how we think that they might contribute to our findings or be similar to our findings. None of my studies were an RCT, and so they were longitudinal or cross-sectional, so they can't establish that causal relationship. So then I went over here to talk about how this is how we think that it might be related in terms of the causal relationship. So loneliness may trigger the HPA axis, and then that ultimately increases the neurotoxicity in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex that ultimately leads to decreased memory and learning. So that's what we think. And so then my future direction is, yeah, we've done all these studies that are cross-sectional, longitudinal. Somebody needs to do an RCT so that we can really find out what is going on with this and then make definitive decisions. So you can see how kind of everything goes together. And, you know, what I did, my process is always to, you know, I get the table, you know, put everything in the table, and then I look for at least three points that I could talk about in the discussion. So mine were the loneliness measure. I had a lot of them. The loneliness measure, the cognitive measure, and something else I forgot. So even if it's just those two, so then I know, okay, I'm going to talk about loneliness measure, cognitive measure, and the studies, I guess, the study, the research design. So all those are important. So then I need to make sure in the findings, I talk about loneliness measure, cognitive measure, research design, and report those to the reader. And then, again, I go back in the discussion and talk about all these 3 points in terms of discussion and the implications and what that could mean. And then you go always in the conclusion, and it needs to just be concise, and you then restate the major points of the paper. So I would have some sentences in there and then include at some point loneliness, you know, measure, cognitive measure, research design, whatever the main points. So that's just what I wanted to go over with you because there seemed to be some confusion. So just real quick, findings, you just state what it is. No motion, no thoughts, no nothing, just the facts. In the discussion then is when you can bring in your thoughts and, you know, this is what may be causing this or possibly this could be causing that based on other things that we have in the literature. So there you can insert your opinions and your thoughts that are, of course, based on science. So I would just advise you to, you know, use my paper, use this article just kind of as a guide. Overall, things need to be very concise and as few words as possible because it does cost the journal money to print per word. And so they want that limited. And I think my video is about to stop. So let me know if you have any questions.